Hi, and welcome to Writing Essentials with Mrs. Benson. Today, we will be talking about the very important skill of quotation embedding. And this is applicable to argumentative writing, to literary analysis writing, to any informational writing, research writing. It's a really helpful skill in all genres of writing, but in particular with literary analysis. So let's get started. When you include a quotation in your writing, it's generally best to embed the quoted material. So when in doubt, aim for quotation integration and blending or embedding. There's lots of different terms that teachers use for this. In order to do this well, you want to provide adequate context before you give your quoted material. So consider what information would be helpful for your reader to know before giving the quote. So we don't lead with the quote, we lead with context. I like to think of the 5 journalistic questions of who, what, where, when, why, not necessarily in knowing that I'm going to provide all of those for my context, but those will lead me in the right direction to considering what, who, what, where, when, why, which of those will be most helpful for me to establish the context. I don't want to just throw a quote from a story in. I want to orient my reader to what part of the story am I talking about, which characters are involved, what's the plot situation, in order for the quote to be more easily understood and comprehended. Your language and the quoted language should blend smoothly. That's the aim. We don't want there to be a sense of choppiness or disconnectedness, changing in tense or changing in pronouns and proper nouns. We want it to flow and make sense with your voice. More often than not, less is more when you are embedding. Quote only the most significant portions of the text. There is not an idea of, I want my essay to be longer, so I better just give long quotes. That's not the aim. The aim is to give just the quoted material that's very focused and specific to the point that you're trying to make. Now, something we'll talk about in a bit is the idea that you may need to change pronouns or verbs in order to have an accurate flow with your language. And in order to do that, we use brackets. I have some examples that will be coming shortly. Here are some tips for your quotation embedding. You always integrate your quotes. You don't want to just drop them in. So I've said that already once, and now I'm going to say it again, and I'll probably say it another time because that is the most significant error that I see. The most common error from students is just throwing a quote full sentence without any lead in. So you don't want a piece of textual evidence to stand alone as its own sentence. You want to use your words to introduce the quote and only use the most effective parts of the quote. This helps you to maintain a really smooth sentence style. Now, about those brackets, you use the brackets, see them there. They're like the parentheses that are a little more linear. You use those when you need to add or change a word to help with the flow. So here's an example. Tom wanted to bring his own paintbrush to the gathering. Notice how that sentence, if you closed your eyes and heard it, would sound very logical and it would flow well and there wouldn't be anything awkward about it. The original quote had it as a part of dialogue. The quote said, "Bring my own paintbrush," because Tom was saying this. Now, if I had left the my in the quote, it would have read as, "Tom wanted to bring my own paintbrush to the gathering." Well, that's a little awkward, right? So, because I'm talking about Tom in the third person, even though the quote is in the first person, I can manipulate it by using brackets to remain in the third person. This allows for fluency and understanding and comprehension, and it eliminates that sort of cumbersome evaluation in the reader's mind of figuring out, oh, okay, that was a quote and this is not a quote. So he just didn't change it or whatever. So you don't want to make your reader work that hard. Make it clear and straightforward and easy to understand by changing pronouns or verbs in brackets when it makes sense with your fluency. Now, another thing you might want to keep in mind is that sometimes it's really powerful to use what's called a signal phrase in order to lead into your quoted material. This is more often used in research writing and argumentative writing, but it's still something good to understand and keep in mind just with the principles of quotation embedding as a whole. So if you're trying to point out something that a writer is doing or saying or observing, you can use these signals, they're essentially all verbs, to highlight that. What we want to try to avoid is shows, says, states, writes, those verbs. And we want a little bit stronger, more compelling verb choices to lead into quoted material. Observes, reasons, asserts, supports, echoes. There are much more dynamic and interesting verbs out there. So just keep those in mind as options when you're presenting quoted material. But again, that more often than not happens it's more prevalent in argumentative and research writing than in your literary analysis writing, but I do see it used and can be used effectively there. So there are 3 ways you can present quoted material effectively in an essay, but one is supreme. One beats out the others. It doesn't mean the others are impossible to use or totally horrible to use, but the quotation embedding method is our best and what we want to use the most. And we may find ourselves, depending on the length of the paper and how much evidence we're presenting, using the other 2 methods maybe once or twice, again, depending on how many quotes I'm using. If I'm writing a 10-page paper and I have about, I don't know, 15 to 20 quotes in there, I could certainly see myself using all 3 methods. But if I'm presenting a shorter piece, maybe a 1 to 2 page paper where I'm only presenting 3 or 4 quotes, then I would very often not see the second or third methods at all. But I want to present all of them to you because similar to choosing action verbs over linking verbs aren't bad. We just want to lean into action verbs because they're stronger. Here we have quotation embedding as our strongest method, but then we do have some powerful moments that we could use these other 2 methods as well. So the most often preferred method is to embed your quotes. Here's an example. As a fireman with the mission to eliminate dangerous knowledge, Guy Montag finds it a pleasure to burn books. 1. So you can see the only quoted material is pleasure to burn. It is embedded with my language. If you had your eyes closed, there would be nothing that sounded awkward about it or transitory. You couldn't even really fully tell what was the quote and what wasn't. That's good. And I have a citation. MLA citations, it's really simple. You just put the page number. You don't put P period or PG period or hashtag in the number. You just put the number. If you happen to be quoting from multiple works, then you want to put the author's last name, space, and the number. But if your essay is all from one piece, we can very rightly assume that it's all from that same author, so you don't have to keep putting the author's last name. Now, the second method is to provide a full quotation. We don't want to lean into this method because full quotations inserted in our essays have a tendency to lose the reader because they're long. And then I begin to forget what was the point in showing this quote in the first place. So the more tightly condensed and packaged we can get our quotes, the more our reader will remember our point and our focus and our purpose. So these longer quotes can have a little bit more of a risk of losing your reader. However, again, if I'm writing a longer essay, if I really need that whole sentence to make my point heard, and some sentences are quite short, so it makes sense to include the whole sentence, then you can use this method. You would just want to do some sort of a context lead-in. Guy Montag asks Clarice, comma, Why aren't you in school? And then the page number. So you need still a lead-in in order to present that full quote. And this is when a signal word would be good: asks, asserts, observes, wonders, some kind of a verb to lead into the quote. Again, very sparingly use those full sentence ones. Another example of full sentence that is a little bit more sophisticated. I remember I didn't start using this until I was at the college level of literary analysis. That would be the colon introduction. So this is when you put in a complete thought, an independent clause, colon, and then a full sentence quote, a full independent clause on the other side of quoted material. Again, this is used sparingly, but can be used quite effectively. Look at the example. Before awakening to the dystopia surrounding him, Guy Montag accepted and even enjoyed his position as a fireman, colon, it was a pleasure to burn. And there's a whole sentence, right? So you can see that I'm stating the situation in the text, and then I'm providing the evidence with the quote after. You got to be a little more adept and sophisticated as a writer, and at the same time, if you're ready and willing, go ahead and go for it. Keep in mind, quotation embedding is our best option. Here are some examples I'm going to go through a little bit more quickly to show what quotation embedding, good quotation embedding, looks like. I'll just be reading these and you can kind of see for yourself how they work. The original: Hemingway hints of a storm on the move. The shadow of a cloud moved across the field of grain. Smoothly embedded in the sentence reads, a storm approaches the town as the shadow of a cloud moves across the field of grain and Maggie turns back to the forest. Also, at times, you might want to consider using those signal phrases. Here's an example of that. T.S. Eliot, in his Talent in the Individual, uses gender-specific language. He argues, for instance, that no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. Indeed, his significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. Again, longer quote, but you could see an example of a signal lead-in. This would have to be for a much longer essay. Another example. Night also represents the fire that killed so many people. And just as the train stopped, this time we saw flames rising from a chimney into a dark sky. Revised. Wiesel suggests night represents death by fire as he and other passengers witness flames rising from a chimney into a dark sky, which are no doubt burning people alive. Another example. Throughout the book, most of the killings or horrible events, including Ellie, occurred during the night. They must have taken him away before daybreak and taken him to the crematorium. Revised. Throughout the novel, many horrible events, including the killings, occurred during the night. Indeed, Wiesel tells of a man taken away before daybreak to the crematorium. In this example, I wanted to point out that there were ellipses. Those dots. Now, I would highly recommend you use these very sparingly. You do not need to use them leading into quotes or leading out to quotes, even if you're quoting just a piece of a sentence and not the beginning or the end. You only need to include them if you omit a word, but still want to use the words on either side of it. So if you omit a piece of the text, but you're using something on either side of the sentence, then you do want to include them. But again, you don't want your paper to look like you took a pepper shaker and sprinkled it all over the writing and I see dots everywhere. You want to use those ellipses very judiciously and sparingly, and only when you really need it in the context of putting in your quoted material. That's it for quotation embedding. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a good time embedding your quotes as you continue analyzing literature. Take care.